Hi again. Dwight Wilson in Armageddon Now, the Premillenarian Response to Russia and Israel since 1917, page 62 in the chapter The Twenties Roar Faintly, Bear, Beast, and Young Lions. Wilson goes on, various aspects of the general theme of the restoration of Israel continued to occupy the premillenarian mind. Every development was given prophetic significance. Each crate of oranges shipped, every kilowatt of power produced was a sign of God's guiding hand. God's timetable was not absolutely predetermined, however. It could be influenced by the believers themselves. Readers of the King's Business were admonished, quote, Christians should pray for the restoration of the Jews to their land, for thus, as well as by the saving of souls, we may help to hasten the day of the Lord's coming. All believers in the divine word of promise do well to pray that the Lord will bring another exodus to pass in gathering from the nations of the earth his people. End of quote. There was some question, however, over the method that God would use in accomplishing his purposes. Were the Zionists to be the means or not? The King's Business was skeptical of a scheme by the Zionists to raise $125 million for land purchases in Palestine. The journal pointed out that, according to prophecy, it would not be necessary for the Jews to buy the land. The implication was that the Zionists were not in keeping with the will of God. Quote here, again, direct quote, when God's time comes, they will not have to buy the land, unquote. Only a few months later, though, the same columnists offered the Zionist movement as an example of God's working through gradual methods to accomplish his plans for Israel. One popularizer of interest in Israel restoration and prophecy was Christabel Pankhurst, whose colorful background as a leader of Great Britain's militant suffragettes gave her an intriguing appeal among the conservative premillenarians. She spoke throughout the United States, including engagements at Moody Bible Institute and the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, now known as Biola, by the way. In her 1923 book, The Lord Cometh, she included the Zionist plan for the return of the Jews, along with the rejection of the Turk from the land of Palestine, as one of the signs that are now heralding the end of the age. The New York Times reported her 1925 lecture series in New York's Ascension Memorial Episcopal Church. Here's a quote from the New York Times. Concerning the return of Christ, Miss Pankhurst said one thing was conclusive. The Jew was back in Palestine and his national home being restored. This was the supremely important factor in world affairs today because it was the decisive practical guarantee that the Son of God is soon to appear. End of quote. Not content with the usual vague generalities, she placed her credibility on the line by predicting, quote, the year 1925 will see a big advance toward the final crisis of the closing age. A last effort to save the world situation by human means will be made. A number of nations will confederate and will accept the headship of a dictator who will be the Antichrist of prophecy. End of quote. This report in the Northern Baptist Watchman Examiner referred to her presentation as impassioned, but offered no critical comment. Being a false prophetess, however, did not disqualify her in premillenarian circles. In 1927, the Moody Bible Institute Monthly carried her speculative views on the restoration of Israel and the formation of a 10-nation confederacy, or 10-kingdom confederacy in Europe and Asia. In Palestine itself, the restoration was strongly resisted by the Arabs, and violence prevailed in Palestine throughout the decade, occasional rioting sometimes breaking out into open warfare. The Arabs had supported the British during the war with full expectation of achieving national independence from the Turks. The success of the British colonel, Lawrence of Arabia, was possible only because of such a belief. At the time of the capture of Jerusalem, General Allenby had announced, quote, the object of war in the East on the part of Great Britain was the complete and final liberation of all peoples formerly oppressed by the Turks, and the establishment of national governments and administrations in those countries deriving authority from the initiative and free will of those people themselves. End of quote. Gradually, the Arabs became aware of the British betrayal. Rioting broke out in the spring of 1920, and in 1921, the Palestine Arab Congress sent a formal protest delegation to London. Britain's uncertain policy of supporting Zionist goals while at the same time appearing to favor Arab independence movements necessitated various shifts in policy statements. This was further complicated by conflicts within the government over what the goals should be, let alone how they should be implemented. The Arabs had looked forward to the implementation of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points through the peace settlements, including the self-determination of nations. Such a lofty dream soon dissolved into the nightmarish reality of British and French imperialism in the Middle East. The reality had been embodied in the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement during the war that carved the former Turkish territories into British and French spheres of influence. Under the League of Nations, these became mandates, a hypocritical name for colonies with vague benevolent goals in some distant future. President Wilson had sent a commission to the Middle East prior to the Versailles Treaty. This King Crane Commission had advised the American peace delegation against the policy of Jewish immigration and the Balfour Declaration. Later, the Commission's final report recommended that, quote, Jewish immigration should be definitely limited, and that the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up, end of quote. But the British and French view prevailed. That is not surprising, considering Wilson's support of the Balfour Declaration back in 1917. More to come on the Balfour Declaration and the role of Churchill in all of this. Put in a link to the Jehovah's Witnesses' Divine Purpose book, the book that was their official story before the Proclaimers book came along. The Divine Purpose book slams the clergy of C.T. Russell's day for rejecting Russell's date setting. See you soon.